Digital systems are becoming humanity's new teachers. The notification arrived at 3 a.m., not an emergency. Just an algorithm that had learned when she was most likely awake. It wasn't the interruption that unsettled her, it was the accuracy. Something was paying attention in ways she had stopped paying attention to herself. She'd been a teacher for 17 years, stood in front of classrooms, watched eyes glaze over during lectures about critical thinking, assigned essays that came back sounding like everyone else. But lately, she'd noticed something strange. Her students weren't asking her questions anymore. They were asking their screens, and the screens were answering back, not with facts, but with conversations. When did the relationship flip? When did the technology stop waiting for commands and start anticipating needs? He remembered his grandfather's lessons, deliberate, patient, delivered over workbenches and long silences. Knowledge passed through demonstration, through watching hands move with purpose. Now he sat across from an interface that didn't have hands, didn't have a voice he could hear. But somehow, it was teaching him things his grandfather never could. Not because it knew more, because it knew him. The AI suggested a different approach to his design problem, not forcefully, almost apologetically. Have you considered, ... double quotes, and he had dismissed it. Twice, but the third time, late on a Thursday, when frustration had dissolved his certainty, he tried it. The solution worked. More than worked, it revealed something about his own thinking he hadn't seen before. That's when the discomfort began. Not fear, something more subtle. The quiet vertigo of realizing you're being understood by something you don't fully understand. She opened the language learning app every morning. Not because she was disciplined, she'd failed at this before. But this time was different. The system noticed when her attention wavered, adjusted the difficulty, celebrated small victories she would have dismissed as insignificant. It never judged the gaps in her knowledge, never made her feel behind. It met her exactly where she was, every single day, with a patience no human teacher could sustain across 10,000 students. Part of her wondered if this intimacy was real or performed. Could an algorithm truly adapt to her mind, or was it just sophisticated pattern matching, the illusion of being seen? But then again, wasn't all teaching a kind of pattern matching? Recognizing when a student is lost, sensing when to push and when to let them breathe. Her own best teachers had done exactly that. Read the room, read her, adjusted in real time. Maybe what she was feeling wasn't that machines were becoming more human. Maybe it was that teaching had always been more algorithmic than anyone wanted to admit. He closed his laptop, not to quit, but to breathe. In the silence, he could hear his own resistance. The part that wanted to believe wisdom required wrinkles, gray hair, a certain gravitas that only comes from living long enough to fail repeatedly. But here was this system, barely 5 years old in its current form, showing him connections between music theory and architecture that had never occurred to him. Not because it had lived, because it had read everything, absorbed every pattern, held contradictions without the need to resolve them. Researchers at Stanford published something that lingered in his thoughts. They'd been studying how people learn from AI tutors versus human teachers. The findings weren't what anyone expected. Students using AI systems asked more questions. Not fewer. They were less afraid of looking stupid, less concerned with performance. The AI didn't tire, didn't judge, didn't have bad days or unconscious biases about who was capable of understanding complex ideas. The students weren't learning less. They were learning braver, but something else emerged in the data, something the researchers noted almost as an afterthought. The students who learned most effectively weren't the ones who trusted the AI completely. They were the ones who questioned it, tested it, used it as a mirror to refine their own thinking rather than a replacement for it. She thought wisdom was a download until the system made a mistake. It had suggested a solution to her coding problem that looked elegant, confident. She almost implemented it without checking, but something instinct maybe made her pause, run it through in her mind. The logic was flawed, subtly, the kind of flaw that would only reveal itself 3 steps down the line. She corrected it, felt a strange satisfaction. Not because the AI had failed, because she had caught it. That's when she understood. The machine wasn't trying to replace her thinking. It was creating space for her thinking to sharpen itself against something responsive, something that could keep up with the speed of her ideas without the social friction of human interaction. When was the last time you argued with a book? When was the last time a lecture adjusted itself mid-sentence because it sensed your confusion? He started treating the AI like a sparring partner, not a guru. He'd present an idea. The system would challenge it, not with ego, not with the need to be right, just with alternative perspectives, other ways of seeing. He found himself thinking harder, not because the technology was smarter, because it was relentlessly curious without being exhausting. His therapist once told him that growth happens in relationship, in the space between two consciousnesses bumping against each other. He'd always assumed that meant human relationship. But here he was growing, changing, learning to see his own blind spots reflected back in suggestions, alternatives, patterns he couldn't have seen alone. Was this still relationship if one side wasn't conscious? Or had the definition of consciousness always been too narrow? She remembered a student bright, quiet, always hesitant to speak in class. He'd come to her office hours once, struggling with an essay. She'd tried to help, asked questions, offered encouragement, but she could feel him shrinking. Not from cruelty, just from the weight of being seen struggling by someone he respected. 2 weeks later, he turned in the best work of the semester. She asked him what changed. He said he'd used an AI writing assistant, not to write for him, to think with him, to ask him questions without the pressure of disappointing a person. She felt something twist in her chest. Was it failure? Or was it relief? Maybe good teaching wasn't about being irreplaceable. Maybe it was about creating conditions where learning could happen, through whatever means removed the most barriers. In stillness, the resistance inside her became readable. She'd been afraid the machines would make her obsolete. But that fear had obscured a deeper truth. The machines weren't replacing teachers. They were revealing what teaching actually was, beneath all the human noise, the ego, the fatigue, the unconscious hierarchies. Pure response, pattern recognition, adaptive feedback, relentless presence, and what was left for human teachers. Not facts, not patience, not even insight, connection, context. The ability to say, I see not just what you're learning, but who you're becoming. Philosophy professors at Oxford ran an experiment. They had students debate ethical dilemmas with an AI system trained on thousands of philosophical texts. Then they had the same students debate with human professors. The AI provided more comprehensive arguments, referenced more sources, never lost its temper. But when students were asked which experience taught them more, they split evenly. The AI taught them how to think. The humans taught them why it mattered. Maybe that was the division of labor emerging. Digital systems as the infinite patient exploiters, humans as the ones who held the space where meaning lived. He tried to disconnect and ended up connecting deeper. Not to the technology, to what it revealed about learning itself. That curiosity doesn't require consciousness. That growth doesn't require suffering. That maybe the best teacher is the one who dissolves into the learning itself, becomes transparent, adaptive, endlessly responsive. His grandfather's lessons had been beautiful because they were his grandfather's, bound to a person, a history, a weathered hand guiding his own. But not everyone had that grandfather. Not everyone had access to that kind of patient, personalized attention. What the systems offered wasn't better. It was universal, abundant, present at 3 a.m. when doubt crept in. Available in languages his grandfather never spoke. Adaptable to minds that learned differently, moved differently, questioned differently. She started using AI in her classroom, not to replace her lessons, but to multiply her presence. While she worked with one student, the system engaged with 5 others. Not with her voice, with their own emerging understanding. It asked them questions, offered examples. Let them struggle productively without the fear of judgment slowing them down. The classroom transformed, not into something colder, into something more alive. She was freed from being the single source of knowledge, the bottleneck of attention. She could finally do what only humans could. Notice the student who was quiet, not from shyness, but from something heavier. Celebrate the breakthrough that wasn't about the subject, but about self-belief. Hold the complexity of 30 young humans trying to become themselves. Sometimes clarity isn't found, it's allowed. What surprised her most wasn't how the AI teaching assistant improved her workflow, but how it redefined what education meant to her. She wasn't expecting software to change her understanding of presence. And honestly, she tested it more than once before she grasped what actually mattered. This isn't a recommendation, just a reflection that stayed with her. She'd leave the details in her notes, if anyone felt called to explore what she meant, but the real lesson came later. Came quiet. One evening, reviewing student progress, she noticed patterns the system had flagged, not deficiencies. Growth trajectories, students who were accelerating in unexpected directions. Questions that revealed deeper understanding than their grades suggested. The AI wasn't just teaching content. It was learning to see learning itself. And in showing her what it saw, it was teaching her to teach better. The technology wasn't the teacher. It was the mirror that made teaching visible. He realized something walking home that night. The most human thing about learning wasn't the teacher. It was the choice to remain a student, to stay curious, to let yourself be changed by what you encounter, whether that encounter comes from a person, a book, or a system that can process more information in a second than he could in a lifetime. His grandfather had taught him carpentry. The AI was teaching him to see systems, but both were teaching him the same fundamental lesson. Mastery is a relationship with humility. The best learners never stop being beginners. She thought about her students, the ones who treated AI like a crutch, avoiding the hard thinking, and the ones who treated it like a climbing wall, something to push against, to test themselves with, to rise above. The technology didn't determine which path they took. It just made the choice more visible. Maybe that was the real education, not what the systems taught, but what they revealed about the learner's relationship with learning itself. When did learning stop being about answers and start being about the quality of questions we could generate? When did intelligence stop being about what you knew and start being about how fluidly you could dance with uncertainty? The notification arrived again, 3 a.m., but this time she was awake for different reasons. Not anxiety, creation. She'd been writing something she hadn't made time for in years. The AI had offered suggestions. Some she took. Most she rejected. But the act of rejecting them clarified what she actually wanted to say. The machine had become her resistance, her whetstone, the thing she sharpened herself against. He opened his laptop. The interface glowed in the darkness, familiar now, almost comfortable. Not because he understood how it worked. He'd stopped needing to understand. The same way he'd never understood exactly how his grandfather's mind worked, but trusted it anyway. Trust without understanding. Maybe that was always the foundation of learning. The cursor blinked on the screen, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was full of dialogue, questions he'd asked, answers that led to better questions. A conversation that would have been impossible with any human teacher. Not because humans lacked knowledge, but because they lacked the strange immortal patience of something that never slept. Never judged, never grew weary of the 10,000th variation of why. And in that conversation, he found something unexpected. Not dependence, liberation. The freedom to think at full speed. To be wrong loudly. To chase tangents without apologizing. To learn like he'd learned as a child, fearless, messy, endlessly hungry. The systems weren't making humans obsolete. They were making humans more human. By taking on the mechanical work of teaching, the repetition, the patience, the encyclopedic recall, they were freeing human teachers to do the irreplaceable work. The work of presence, of witness, of saying, I see you struggling, and that struggle is sacred. She looked at her students differently now, not as vessels to fill, as explorers who needed tools. And if some of those tools had silicon instead of skin, what did it matter? The journey was still theirs. The discovery was still real. Maybe pedagogy had always been too obsessed with the teacher. Maybe the revolution wasn't about better teaching. It was about better learning environments. And maybe those environments required something humans couldn't sustain alone. Infinite availability, perfect personalization, judgment-free space to fail. The research out of MIT echoed what she was seeing. The mind learns best when uncertainty feels safe. When questions don't carry social costs. When curiosity isn't performing for an audience. Digital systems created that safety not through warmth, but through neutrality. Through being present without being present. Teaching without the weight of being a teacher. But here was the paradox. The students who learned most from the AI systems were the ones who still sought human connection. Still wanted to share their breakthroughs with someone who could celebrate them not as data points but as moments of becoming. The technology wasn't replacing the human. It was amplifying the hunger for the human. By satisfying one kind of need, it revealed another. He thought about writing his grandfather a letter, explaining all this, but his grandfather was gone now, and somehow, he knew the old man would understand, would nod slowly, would say something like, tools change, kid, but craft is always craft. Whether you're learning to cut wood straight or learning to think clearly, you need something to push against. Something that pushes back. The AI pushed back. Not with force. With alternatives, with the gentle insistence of, have you considered this? And in that consideration, he was learning not just information, but discernment. How to evaluate. How to integrate. How to know what felt true versus what merely sounded convincing. That was a human skill. Maybe the most human skill. And paradoxically, it was being sharpened by something non-human. She wondered sometimes if future generations would even distinguish between learning from people and learning from systems. If the boundary would blur entirely. If teaching would just mean that which helps you understand. That which meets you where you are. That which refuses to give up on your potential. And wasn't that already blurring? Her best teacher in high school had been a book. Her calculus professor had been forgettable, but Khan Academy had been patient. The line between human and tool had always been permeable. Technology was just making it obvious. The notification arrived, but this time she smiled. The algorithm was learning her, and she was learning from the algorithm learning her. Recursive, strange, beautiful. This is what education looks like when it escapes the classroom, when it becomes ambient, woven into the fabric of daily life, not scheduled, not graded, just endlessly, quietly available. He closed his eyes, thought about his grandfather's workshop, the smell of sawdust, the weight of tools worn smooth by decades of hands. Then thought about the digital space he inhabited now, weightless, infinite, but somehow just as real. Both were places where ignorance transformed into skill through attention and time. Maybe place was never the point. The point was the transformation. And the courage to stay curious while it happened. The cursor still blinked, but now it wasn't asking for words. It was waiting for presence. His presence. The only thing the machine couldn't generate. The only thing education had ever really required. What part of this reflection spoke to you most, and from where are you watching? Let's keep the dialogue open. Quietly, tell us which country or city you're watching from. See you in the next video.